We've got four different sections. One section
Okay.
about your personal background, and that means when you were a student up to where you're now as a professional teacher. Then the second section will be talking about your project across the Atlantic and comparing the both educational systems in Europe and in the States. And then the third part will be part of music education when you are a teacher and you're maybe summarizing certain pitfalls that the students faced over a period of, their 4 years when they were at university. And the final ones is words of wisdom. What kind of advice would you give to students when they're in the first year at their introduction date and when they're in the fourth year when they're leaving the school, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with your personal background. So what city do you come from and what was your upbringing in music?
Well, I'm actually from Canada originally.
Mm-hmm.
So I come from Windsor, Ontario, which is about a kilometer across a river from Detroit, Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
So I always considered myself kind of a Detroit area. That's where I grew up. That's what I studied. That's who people I studied with. That's where I played. And so I consider that to be kind of my, partially my hometown, I guess. And it was just a great place to grow up. I mean, Detroit, there's a new book out by Mark Stryker on the jazz scene in Detroit and how that fed the rest of the country and New York with the various big bands and a lot of the pianists that came out of there. So I just grew up in a city that had such a rich jazz history, and I got to study with those people. I got to play with those people from a very young age, and that just made a big difference for me. I was constantly involved in music with really good players who somehow they let a young kid in to play with them in certain venues, and it just took off from there. In terms of my family background, my parents are immigrants from they're German, but from Yugoslavia.
Okay.
Came over. They were refugees in the Second World War, and the whole village wound up in Windsor. So my first language is German. I grew up speaking German. I didn't speak English when I went to grade school.
Okay.
So I have a very kind of mixed background. I feel very much European in certain ways, and also, of course, Canadian American in certain ways as well. But so I had that background, and of course, music was a big part of European culture, and same with my family. My dad is a lifelong singer and choir member. His dad was a really good violinist. So we just had a lot of music. It was just understood when you're 5 years old, you learn how to play music. That's it. You pick an instrument and go. So.
Well,
that's
because you're a piano player. Do you remember? Was your approach to music education introduction through music school, or was it here's a piano and it was a lot of fun, so you picked up a lot of stuff by yourself from recordings?
Well, I went to I am actually a trumpet player as well, so a lot of my early professional stuff was done on trumpet, but I also played piano. And so I had to make a choice at some point, what direction do I want to go, and it wasn't really hard to make. Piano was just to me a bigger picture than the trumpet, for what I wanted to do in music. So I started taking lessons when I was 5 on 2 instruments, and I was just sort of a local music teacher who was from the community, a good player, but it was a kind of a traditional thing. And then in high school, I got involved in jazz bands, and I really took off on that. I really got interested in it. Then I started taking lessons with some of the name players in Windsor and Detroit. And pretty soon I was getting hired as a sub for a gig, and next thing you know, I was working. That was kind of it. And back in those days, there was a lot of work. You could do a lot. There was a lot of playing going on, and you got paid for it. So one of when I was 17, I got, they used to book a lot of horn sections and rhythm sections out of Detroit for touring companies in New York. So I got called for one of those. It was kind of a traveling vaudeville show. But I was 17 and working with Gordon Edwards, who was a bass player with the band Stuff, and he played with Joe Cocker, and I don't know who else. So I all of a sudden in New York City and Atlantic City, 17 years old, and but it was all because of Detroit connections. So yeah, just so much going on in Detroit. Like all of those musicians on the Motown records, those were all jazz musicians who played around town, and that's who I played with. That's who I studied with. Marcus Belgrave, Earl Van Dyke, Trudell. All these people were, I didn't know how famous they were when I was 16, but, that was the scene back then. So I feel really fortunate that I grew up in that area because music was so important. I think it still is, but especially at that time, it was a big part of the culture there. I don't think people realize how important Detroit was to the jazz scene as a place in between Chicago and New York, where a lot of players grew up. A lot of players were trained, and then they went to those other cities. I just read an article on Ethan Iverson's blog where he's interviewing Mark Stryker, who wrote the book about jazz. And Iverson says, without Detroit, there's no jazz. And I agree with him. I think it's such an untold story there, what a rich melting pot and what a feeder it was for those other places because of the culture, because music is such a big part of the culture there. So yeah, it's got the Rust Belt vibe, but I also think it's got kind of a gritty, it's a street city everywhere. It's gritty, it's a little bit grungy, and it's just a place where music that's like that can grow. It's like a fungus. It works. I don't know why. It's a great city for jazz, and still is, from what I can tell.
Because at the moment you're a scholar, right? So if you're working like a detective and you go backwards, how did you get to the point that you're a scholar and a writer?
Well, it was just expected in my family that we get a degree. And because I was in music, I'm going to go do a music degree. So I went to the school in my hometown, and I did this degree, but I didn't know what to do. I started in performance, but I didn't really like that because they were pushing me to do so much classical stuff, which I like, but I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to play all classical music, and I was already working. I was working 4 or 5 nights a week in Detroit, making pretty good money. And I thought, I don't need a performance degree. So I blew that degree off after a semester. Then I did music ed. I thought, okay, I'll do music ed. And I didn't like that either because it just didn't seem, I don't know. I didn't want to learn how to play the clarinet. I was already busy enough doing my own stuff, and I didn't want to teach high school. I knew that. And so I almost dropped out after the second year. And then one of the professors said, there's a degree here that might fit you better. And I said, what is it? He said, it's the Bachelor of Arts with a music major. So it was a BA, but with music as the main thing. But to me, that was a much better fit because I could study what I wanted. I studied anthropology. I studied acoustics. I studied a lot of different things. And I also did music, but it wasn't in the regimen of a strict performance degree or an education degree or something. So it gave me the flexibility I needed, but I almost dropped out because it was it just didn't fit me. And that's kind of been the story of my life, I think, with those degrees.
Who would you assign a credit to for your education that you're proud of? Who had the biggest influence as a teacher on you? Was it a mentor? Was it a school? Was it a moment or an event? Maybe it's got different stages.
For me, there was a big turning point for me, and it's going to be a musician that I never met and I never saw play live, and that's the pianist Bill Evans. I was sitting in a practice room in my undergraduate degree, and I have just a habit of, I want to read through all the tunes. So I'm going through the fake book, and I'm just reading the tunes, and I came across, and I knew who Bill Evans was, but I hadn't really dug deep into his work. Because he wasn't quite as popular in that area. It was more hard bop, Detroit, And I played this tune, Time Remembered.
Okay.
And it was, to me, it was like, "Ah, this is what I've been looking for. This is the sound that I want." And then I realized there's no dominant chord in the whole tune. It's wow. What is this? And from that moment on, I was just rededicated to learning about what he was doing harmonically, melodically, and just really soaking him up musically. So he's someone I never met, but who had just a huge influence on me. I also had several teachers who were like that in different ways. Douglas Green at the University of Texas at Austin, that's where I did my doctorate. He's a total classical guy, but his work with, especially studying counterpoint and analysis, was just, to me, it was just really eye-opening. And I would just go to his office hours all the time, and we'd go through Bach fugues and how's this one constructed? Well, what's this? I just learned a lot from him. So yeah, a couple people like that. Don Thompson, I don't know if you know who Don Thompson is, Canadian bassist and pianist.
Okay, I haven't heard his name.
Yeah, he's in Toronto. Yeah, he's just absolute genius. He played bass with George Shearing.
Okay, yeah, okay, so very traditional, very good.
Oh yeah, very traditional. But he's also a pianist who plays just as well as plays bass. Yeah, and really had. I was in Banff,
in
the
Canada,
arts.
yeah.
Yeah, I was there and I did a concert with Kenny Wheeler.
Oh, amazing!
Yeah, it was amazing. And afterwards, Don came up to me and started talking to me about piano. And he said, "Well, how much transcription have you done?" And I said, "Oh, I've done a little bit." And he just looked me in the eye and says, "When you go home, I want you to transcribe the entire Sunday at the Village Vanguard album of Bill Evans." And I said, "Okay." And then call me or let me know what you think. So that's what I did. So he was a big influence because he really just said, you can play, and what you're doing is great, but you really need to dig in and get, you need to do some more transcription. So those were kind of three big influences that I remember that afterwards things changed for me in a big way. I played with him several times in my career, and on that occasion, we had all the tunes. So it was a band of mostly me and a bass player from Texas, and it was mostly the bass player's tunes, and they were hard tunes. Time signature changes, slash chords. It was with a singer who was kind of doing classical stuff. I can send you a recording of it. It's pretty
Absolutely,
cool.
Do please, yeah.
And I thought, wow, how's he gonna pull this off? It's 40 minutes of music. We have one rehearsal. We go and do the gig, right? And it's hard stuff. And so I watch him. He comes in. We're hanging out. He comes in. He looks at the music. He gets a pencil out. Over each chord, he writes out, the mode or the scale. So he's got these pages. Each one is. And I thought, wow, at that level, that's what you're doing. Writing out scale choices. But then we played it, and he just nailed it. It was like, wow. Like you said, everything it was like he'd been living inside of this music for a decade already. It was incredible. Another great learning experience to say, hey, at that level, he's not just leaving it to chance. He's analyzing it, getting ready, and then somehow he puts all the analysis away and is just creative, and it just sounds beautiful. It was an amazing thing to see. If you played with him too, you know that feeling of, I'm sitting there playing and think, oh, beautiful. Oh, I got to get back to the chords here.
Yeah. Sometimes it's difficult to describe geniuses with words, right? But, when you're sitting next to them, you feel that there's the presence of a genius.
Yeah, and it changes your playing. All of a sudden, it's not just, okay, I'm going to do my thing. All of a sudden, you're really focused on trying to, blend and trying to accompany properly, rather than kind of doing stock, chord changes or whatever. All of a sudden, everything gets really important, which is great.
Are there any books that you think are books that every music student should have in their collection of instructional material? And it could be books for piano methods, history, philosophy, blogs, or something that is in a more modern, contemporary way students can relate to.
In the modern era, it's what's really cool is that there are jazz musicians who are writing currently in blogs and in essays, and they're talking about the music and the culture and where it's going, like Iverson, like VJ.
Yep.
That's sort of, 30 years ago there wasn't that much of that. You didn't have musicians, real top level musicians, writing a lot about the music. But now you've got this convergence of the artist and the kind of these amateur scholars who are writing about their experience with the music and trying to further that. Even Brad Meldau is kind of like that. He writes a lot. Liner notes are very philosophical, whereas if you went back, 30 years, 20 years, there's nothing there really from the actual sources. So I really encourage students to take advantage of that and read what all these players are writing about, because they're vocal about it now for the first time, other than autobiography kind of stuff. You know what I mean? As far as books and things, someone who used a lot of the early method books, the Aebersold stuff, David Baker. Let's see, what else? I mean, those in the 70s, 80s, those were kind of the books. I'm really one to say, get to the source material. Don't spend too much time in the books, because use the sources. If you listen to Prokofiev, go to the library and get a score and sight read it. Figure out what those sounds are that you like in Prokofiev, rather than reading about what someone else thinks about it or how someone else puts it together. So I'm really a believer in getting right to the transcription and get to the source, and then use the other texts as supplements to that, to maybe a short form to help you remember stuff or to get the terminology right. I like the Chuck Schur publishing out in San Francisco. Mm-hmm. So the jazz piano book, Mark Levine. He's also got a jazz theory book. Yeah, I think those are great books to have for any jazz musician, because they're really concise, and even if you're not a pianist, the jazz piano book shows instrumentalists, horn players, sax players, drummers, how to construct those sounds and what they're hearing when you're hearing a pianist or a guitar player play those chords. Mm. So, I do think some of those are really good to have around. Of course, with this one, what happened was my teacher, Doug Green, who I mentioned, he had these little one-page handouts. They called them "Be an Instant Expert on," whatever the topic was. So be an instant expert on fugues. And then he would just give point form. These are the types. These are the types of, in minor key, this one, it's just one sheet that you could just have all the point form stuff. So when I started teaching, I took that on and I wrote one. I said, all right, be an instant expert on pentatonic scales. How do you practice them? Where do they fit? How do you do that? Who do you listen to if you want to see how jazz musicians have dealt with pentatonic scales? So I started writing these, and I just put them on my door. And then the students would take them, and then after, I did one or two, and then they came up and said, hey, can you do one of those on diminished scales? Can you do an instant expert on this and on that? And I said, yeah, okay. So I had all these little sheets, and someone said to me, hey, that's kind of like a book. Why don't you put that together and make it a book? So it came out of teaching and came out of student requests for information. So kind of a side story.
Well, let's talk about the big project of yours across the Atlantic, music education in Europe and in the United States. How did you get an idea to compare these two systems?
Well, it started really with me thinking about how American jazz is different from European jazz. Mm-hmm. And because I would hear, because as someone who felt like, I listen to a lot of European jazz and I love it, But over here, I would hear a lot of people, you know, even in Downbeat magazine, they would make fun of it, like, oh, it's ECM, someone play something. And I thought, well, you know, there's this attitude here and there. So it started off with me thinking, let's just ask jazz musicians on both sides what they think of jazz, how it's developed in Europe and how it's developed in the United States. So that was how it started. And then, so what I did was I contacted the ISJ and contacted JEN over here, which is kind of like the American ISJ. And I said, I'd like to do a survey of your members. Can we send this out? And they both said, yeah, absolutely. So I built a survey. I had to go through the IRB board to show that it was all anonymous and all that stuff. So it was quite a bit at my school that I had to do. And then they sent it out to their memberships, and then I got the responses, and then I put that together. So that's really how that started. But then I got the Fulbright. So I got a Fulbright and I taught at Graz for I was there for 5 months. And once I got there, I realized, you know, that I was in a very different place than United States. I taught jazz theory. It was first year jazz theory at the KUG, the Kunstuniversität. And so I start with ear training, right? Just I want to see where the students are. I start doing, you know, here's an interval, and they're just looking at. There's like 20 kids in the class. They're looking at me. Yeah, that's a perfect fifth. Okay. Well, here's a seventh. Okay, now I'll do. I got to the point where I was almost doing a 12-tone row, and they could do it, and they knew the chords. You know, I'd play pretty complex chords, and they knew them. And then I'd say, all right, what chord is this going to? Most of them could tell or were pretty close. And this is first year jazz theory. Over here in the United States, unless you're at Juilliard or, you know, one of the big top 10 schools, you know, these kids can't, they're just not prepared like that. So at the end of that class, I had students from Brazil, Philippines, I think there was a Chinese student, Germany, England, the US. I think only about half of the students were from Austria. And so I asked them, I said, well, what's your out-of-state tuition here? Because here in the States, if I live in Michigan and go to Chicago and go to school, it's going to cost me twice as much because I'm out of state. And they just looked at me and said, what are you talking about, out of state? You know, because you don't live here. Oh, that. And I said, okay, now I'll find out. They said, well, they charge us 800 euros as an administrative fee. I said, each course? Oh, that's all they get charged. So right away, you know, I went home and I thought, I got to investigate this. So then I added that to what I was doing and kind of put that all together because it was really interesting to me, especially after, you know, someone who's been teaching in the States for so long to be in that other system and to see how different it is, and also being quite dissatisfied with what the system is over here. So that's how it all came about. And then once I started opening the lid on it, I thought, wow, you know, the further I got, the crazier it became, you know. So as you read, yeah.
You got to conclusions such as the level of musicianship and ability to play your instrument in Europe and in the United States. And could you tell a little bit more about it? Because I'm sure that could stir a lot of arguments on both sides.
Well, yeah, there are. I mean, I think it comes down to the difference in the system. So we have to differentiate a little bit. I think in Europe, at most schools, or at least the ones that I saw and people I talked to, you don't get into a music university unless you already have shown that you can play your instrument. You know your scales, you're playing high-level classical literature, you're already a pretty good jazz musician before you get in. So, for example, when I was at Köln, the Hochschule für Musik in Köln, I asked one of the teachers, well, what's your criteria to get into school here? And he said, well, they have to be able to play as well as the faculty. They have to be able to play with the faculty.
Mm.
I thought, wow. I said, and what if you don't find students like that? Then we don't let them in. I said, well, what happens to your funding? It doesn't matter. It doesn't change. Over here, I mean, as you saw in my report, Austria has roughly the same number of people as Michigan. It has 5 places where you can do a music degree. Michigan has 27, and that's not including all the religious schools. There's probably 37 in total. So those schools are all willing to let anyone in. I mean, if you know where the mouthpiece goes, you can get into a music degree somewhere in Michigan, right? But so it's a very different system. But there are also great schools here where the standards are super high, but it's not that way at every school. So that's a big, huge difference. And of course, that's where the funding part of it comes from. In Europe, you can do it. Students don't have to pay as much, sometimes nothing. Why? Well, there's only 5 places you can go. So all those students, there's a place for everyone. There's not 27 places you can go for a place that has roughly the same population, which is crazy, right? And I think that's true all across the United States.
What do you think about that statement? If I'm good enough, I don't need to go to school.
Well, I think maybe for some players, I think a lot of it is personality based. So I think of someone like Keith Jarrett, for example. I mean, he was a genius by the time he was 5. He was playing Bartok.
There you
go. And his personality is such that I don't think he would have survived long in a music school. So that's a different kind of case. And look at Miles Davis, for example, goes to Juilliard, blows it off. So I think a lot of it is personality based. I think if you're that good, Thelonious Monk, or you're that level of player, maybe a music school is going to constrain you too much, and you don't need it. But I think for most players, it's a place where you can go, and I'm talking the ideal. So if I went to the Köln Hochschule or one of those places, a place where I can go for 4 years and develop my craft, build, create some projects, build a resume, and get a degree all at the same time without going broke and without being in a lot of debt. So to me, it's like a preparatory, okay, this is a place I can go and finish up whatever I need to do on the instrument. I can build myself, Ausbildung. I can create some artistic projects that I'm going to use to apply for other jobs or to put a group together for touring. I think that's ultimately what it's really best for. And you can also then get input from professionals on what you're doing, maybe things to explore in different directions. I think to me, that's the ultimate goal. But that's for a student who's already well developed and has the discipline and the vision to say it's time for me to build my foundation of my career. Maybe say 2 CDs. I'm going to record 2 CDs of all original music. That's my undergraduate degree, right? That you can do that right? You can't do that in most places in the United States because they're treating it like high school basically. The students aren't prepared. So it's a real problem, I think, when you compare those 2 systems. So we just have to keep in mind there are 2 or 3 different tiers of schools and students, and you can't put them all together and say they should all do this or they should all do that.
Should I study, in Europe, or should I study in America?
I would tell a European, study in America. Even if you just do 2 years at Berkeley or something. Come to America first. The cultural experience. Come to the place, especially if you're studying jazz. Come to a place where blues and gospel music are part of the culture, and experience American culture and American music and Americans in that environment. Simply to go the other way. If it was an American, like I tell my daughter, I say, why don't you consider going to Europe to study? Why? To get you out of your own zone and experience a whole different world. So I think part of it is that because it depends on your level, of course, too. But you can find a top level school over here to study at, but you also have to pay unless you get scholarships, right? So I think if money weren't involved, I would say go over there or come over here. For the American going to Europe, it's harder to get in because you already have to be really good. For the European coming over here, do you want to pay that much for an education? I think it's worth it. Go live in Boston for a year. Go live in New York City for a year and just take some classes. Just experience life there, which was the hub of jazz, and see what's going on in those cities. So for me, it's a cultural thing too. It's not just the curriculum. You're in that culture as well, and I think that's really important for both sides. I think it'd be great if there were more coming from here and going there, and they're coming over here.
When they finish and they graduate, what kind of working opportunities do you think are waiting for these students?
Well, I think one of the we're getting a little bit on curriculum now, but I think one of the problems with the curriculum is that it's still based in 1930 or 1940 curriculum, where there are Broadway shows, there's musical theater, there's all this other stuff that people could do, and they needed a certain kind of training for it. Those days are gone. As I said in that other presentation, there's so much professional music that requires people who have jazz skills to play it. There's a lot out there. It doesn't mean that's what you want to do, but if you want to work and make money and make a living, there's a lot of ways to do it. But it's probably not playing jazz, right? That's going to be the thing that you're doing on top of that other stuff. So the work opportunities, I think, really, again, have to do with personality. If you're someone that wants to do, you're a purist, you just want to write your own jazz and you want to play it, great. You're probably not going to be able to make a living doing that, right? I don't think anywhere, unless you get to the really top of the heap. So you're going to have a rough time. You're going to have to do something else to make money. If you're someone who can play wedding gigs, who's happy doing musical theater, who can do a church thing or a solo piano gig at a hotel or something, if you've got that kind of personality, there's lots out there. But you're going to have to hustle to do it, to find all the work. So I think there are lots of opportunities, but I think the music schools are not, especially over here, most of them are not preparing people for those things. At most of the schools over here, you're learning how to play, Beethoven or bebop, which is, both are great, but in terms of making a living afterwards, I'm not sure that we're preparing students for that.
What is the teaching career like for a jazz musician?
Well, I can speak from personal experience. It's been great. I've really enjoyed it because I get to hang out with great young musicians, give them some guidance, and hopefully help steer them and let them develop themselves in whatever way they want to go. I've really enjoyed doing that for many years now. And now I teach in an honors college, so I don't do that as much anymore, but I teach music and culture and aesthetics and some historical stuff, which is fun too. So for me, academia was a great choice because I like to write and I like to read, and I've always been interested in philosophy and aesthetics and these other areas. So it was a place for me where I could do that and make a living doing it. And I'm still doing it, and I still love it. I think, again, it's a lot of it is personality based. A lot of musicians I've seen go into academia, and they don't work well in that kind of an environment, and they're unhappy because they don't want to do the writing, or they're not interested in that stuff. They just want to play. So for some people, for me, it was a great fit. For some people, it's not. So it's all kind of personality based, I think.
Were there any results that shocked you?
I guess what really shocked me was, the European system seemed to make a lot more sense to me because it required that the students have higher skills when they come in, which also means they're probably going to have better chance of making a living or being creative artists when they're done. And so to me, that was a much more honest kind of assessment, because students that can't get in to a school are kind of being told, hey, you're not at the level, you're not going to be able to compete with these people we're leaving in. You can do music if you want, but not in a degree. To me, that was kind of honest. What was shocking to me was when I looked at the system over here and I saw how many, especially in the arts, students were letting in because we need to have people in those seats, that the standards kind of go down, 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 that we're not doing them a service. We're taking their money, but we shouldn't be letting them in. There shouldn't be 27 music schools in Michigan where you can get a degree. It's ridiculous. You can just tell what's happening there. Of course, there are the top schools, but then once you go down from that a few, you're, like I said, if you know where the mouthpiece goes in, you can get into a music school. That's unfair. It's not only is it unfair, but it's the word I'm looking for. You know that you're cheating the student out of the money just to keep your school going.
Yeah.
That's not right. So to me, that was the biggest shock to see what actually happens over here as compared to over there. But it's kind of an American thing too. Could be somewhat of a different approach to looking at arts funding. Someone in the survey said, well, in Europe, it's free to go to school, but not everyone can get in. In the States, you got to pay to get in, and that's where we put our artists, but we make them teach for their funding. So, in America, I think the egalitarian part of this country says, well, if you want to go to music school, you should be able to. It should be somewhere you can get in. Yeah, but if you can't play, what are you doing in a music school? So that's a problem.
Are there any common pitfalls how they look at music or music education?
Well, from my experience over here as a teacher, what I've seen is the biggest pitfall is that they think that doing the degree and doing what the teacher says is going to give them something special. And what I've always tried to do is say, it's not. If you don't have a vision for your own development, I can't do anything for you. I can maybe help you play the scales smoother, or I can make you play these other tunes. But if you expect the school to do something for you that you're not doing for yourself, you're wasting your time. The school is there to support you as you're building whatever it is you want to build. And it's not doing whatever courses the school says you're going to do and making it through doesn't really matter. If you're not bringing your own vision to it. So my experience here is that there have been so many students that come through and they just think, if I do the degree and I take the courses they tell me to, something magical will happen when I graduate. Well, it doesn't. It's been the students that come in and they don't want to do all the courses. They want to develop in this way or that way. And those are the students that have been successful afterwards, because they're already focused on their own development, and they don't expect the school to do anything, and they're pissed off when the school gets in their way of developing in the way they want to develop. So, but that's a personality thing. Some students come in and you can just tell, they don't want that. They want to be kind of in high school again, with someone giving them assignments, and then they get a grade, then they get an assignment, then they get a grade, then they say, oh, good, I got an A. Who cares? It's a personality thing, and I've just seen it so many times. So I try and cultivate that in my students, or when I was teaching. What do you want to do? This degree is not going to give you anything that you aren't creating for yourself. And I think it's the same in Europe, but I think students realize it. I think they realize, hey, I got to build. They come in, I can already play. So how do I build this thing to get to the next level?
That was a great answer, Kurt, because that already is a full answer to what kind of advice should a first-year student should get, in their college degree. have a vision for yourself so we can actually help you. Don't expect us to do it.
Right, exactly. We have to get away from the grade school, high school model. University, these are adults. They're not 12-year-olds who need constant guidance and constant, tinkering with. In fact, as I've argued many times, if you took a personality like Thelonious Monk, would he get into music school today? I don't think over here. School say, well, he doesn't play correctly. Well, yeah, he's a genius. He doesn't play correctly because he's got his own vision, So I think we have to somehow come to grips with that. We have to get away from the scientific model that we're using in the arts. That there's courses and you have to be accredited and you have to do this, in this order. It's the arts, right? And I get it if you're in engineering and you're learning how to build bridges. I don't want you experimenting on the bridge I'm crossing. I don't want creative experimentation with the bolts and the steel. But when I listen to someone play music, I want to see that craziness, and I want to see that flower. And within a structure, within a university environment, those cultures tend to strangle after a while. It's hard to keep the freedom in a university environment where you have administrators and deans and presidents and the government. Everyone wants evidence for what you're doing. Are you really producing the right kind of student? What do you mean the right kind of student? It's music. It's not engineering, right? So I think that's my big thing with all of these, with the curriculum and with the students is my advice to a first year student would be look for a place where you can create a program for yourself where they'll accept that, as opposed to a place where you're put in a box. Oh, I'm doing a jazz degree, therefore this is what I'm doing, right? Look for a place where you've got flexibility. And if you don't want flexibility, ask yourself what you're doing in a degree in the first place. Are you just taking time to get a degree? Or maybe you want to teach high school or grade school. Okay, that's cool too. If you want to be a teacher, then you have to do that. But if it's a creative artist thing, ask yourself those questions and look for a program where you can flourish in your own way, because ultimately that's the only way you're going to be successful. No one's successful trying to be another musician, and I think that's what these music schools try to do. Many of them try to create a certain kind of musician. I don't think that's appropriate anymore because the jobs aren't there.
A fourth-year student is just leaving the school, and would like the piece of advice, what it is that your experience tells you to young professionals how they start up their careers.
Well, again, I would say it has to do with what the students' goals are. Do they want to be a working musician? I mean, I have students like that who are they just love working. They do all kinds of gigs. They're not they're good jazz players, but they're not the kind of players who are going to go home and write new high suite and have a 20-minute jazz odyssey. It's not what they're interested in. So those kind of players usually are getting well established already before they come to the end. So I think what you're asking about is the creative musician type who wants to do creative music, wants to do improvised music. What advice would you give them coming out of that, right? Coming out of school? Well, I mean, there's not much advice you can give in terms of how to find gigs, but you can see the models out there, what these people are doing. Take a look at all of the great, in Europe or over here. What did Maria Schneider do, right? What does Ed Partika do? How did they build those careers? They kept at it. They toured, they put bands together, they sponsored their own concerts, they rented halls, they rented rooms, and they kept at it over and over and over again. Emiliano Sampaio from Graz, well, he's from Brazil, but he's in Graz now. He's touring, he puts all this stuff together, and he's building a name and an oeuvre for himself, right? So I mean, it's a hard slug, it's a hard gig. It's not easy. But you can look back and say, how did the Bad Plus do it? Right? How did they do it? They just started playing gigs. They would just go, they're living in a van, driving to the next gig. And then 10 years later, they've got something going on. So, that for the creative type, I would say you also have to be an entrepreneur. You also have to have that business side of it that says, I'm going to hustle, and I'm going to hustle, and I'm going to hustle, and I'm going to write grants, and I'm going to do a gig at the coffee shop, then I'm going to hustle a gig here, and I don't care what it pays. That's the life. And you can see how people have done it. It's not a secret. There's all kinds of people. You can trace their careers back, and they started exactly that way. In the back of a van, driving to an art gallery. They're doing a Sunday afternoon gig from 3 to 5, and they're getting paid, $50 each. And they're driving to the next city, right? And if you don't like that, well, the phone's not going to ring.
The phone is not going to ring.
So the other option is get a job, get a day gig, do something in your other degree, and do your music on the side, and keep it pure. Those are kind of your only options as far as I can see, depending what you can put up with too musically. Some players just can't do wedding gigs. They just can't do it, personality wise. So.
Thank you very much, Kurt.
Hey, great to see you.
Great to see you too. Bye.
Hey, bye-bye.